Oh, my History 461 students, this is Professor Donald Earl Collins. We're going into week 2 to talk about Reconstruction and the impact of the end of slavery, emancipation, and Reconstruction on African Americans, the early rise of Jim Crow in the form of black codes, not necessarily full-blown Jim Crow that we end up having from about the mid-1880s, early 1890s onward. But anyway, so your readings have you going through a variety of things to talk about Reconstruction, the rise of black colleges, or what we now know collectively as HBCUs, as well as or historically black colleges and universities, literacy and education, and there's even a reading you have specifically on basically Reconstruction and education for black folk in Montgomery County, Maryland. I don't really know how that really adds to your learning since most of you probably don't live in Montgomery County, but anyway. Um, Again, I don't choose the readings. I don't choose all the stuff that's going on here. So first, just real quick before I even start talking about that, I want to just say this. Um, most of your discussion answers and posts and responses are somewhere in the neighborhood of solid to very good. Some were even excellent. For the most part, I'm pleased with what people did on different issues, but I must say two quick things in terms of being technical about it. Structural racism and systemic racism are the same thing. It's literally how racism cuts across all sectors of society. That's what systemic racism is. That's what structural racism is. It's not just one institution or one organization. It's literally looking at the society as a whole. So if you want to look at pop culture, that's not an institution. That's just one gigantic aspect of our society, how it's represented. And you can look at racism within pop culture. Now, if you want to break it down to racism at Marvel Comics, or racism at DC Comics, or racism as manifest in Disney movies, now that's institutional racism. That's how Disney does things. But systemic racism, structural racism, cuts across all institutions. So you can look at all of academia, all 4,000 colleges and universities, and see that they have patterns of racial discrimination and harassment that take place at all of those institutions. Cuts across. And it's probably the hardest of all of these forms of racism to understand, precisely because you can it's hard to see at a 30,000 foot level how racism is impacting the society as a whole, because you're stuck in your little silo working at your job or dealing with everyday life, and so you're usually not looking at it at that high a level. So there's that. The other thing about miscegenation, most of you talk about everything else other than the fact that the French had a category for people of color who were mixed blood, so to speak. You know, free people of color. You know, that's not quite how it's written, but in French it means free people of color, right? They create a category specifically for people who were not, African, but were not European. The U.S. never did that. Yes, you have those categorizations in New Orleans and Louisiana, but you have those categorizations there and in parts of Florida precisely because of the fact those two parts of the country weren't originally part of the U.S. They were part of the Spanish Empire or part of the French Empire or had been part of the British Empire at some point between the middle of the 16th century through the beginning of the 19th century. So in those cases, you're going to see different categorizations. But in general, no. It's the U.S. and the British are unique in how they handle the middle category of someone who is not 100% African or 100% white. In that case, and they basically went with the one drop rule and codified it in law, so that basically anybody with even a smidgen of African blood would be black, right? So that's what we're talking about here. But other than that, I mean, most of you did well, and I'm pretty pleased to see that most of you did well on issues regarding trying to understand from a technical standpoint racism, right? You know. So anyway, I wanted to make sure I covered that. Anyway, so here we are this week, actually dealing with African American history. And the thing to understand, first and foremost, is that black history is U.S. history. It's not separate. So when we're talking about Reconstruction, yeah, we're talking about all these other things. It tells you pretty much how central race and racism are to the fundamentals of what is U.S. society, of American society, and its evolution and development over time. And if you accept as a premise that race and racism are pretty central to how the society develops, and you have to understand that it deals with everything: the economics of the society, the rise of the U.S. as an industrial capitalist society, a very rich society where people can make fortunes fairly easily if they had the right ability to exploit and manipulate labor. In this case, African slaves, enslaved African people in this particular case, and they literally fought a civil war over the ability to keep that thing going. So, so set the setting. It's 1865. Lincoln's been assassinated. Um, Andrew Johnson becomes president of the United States by default. This was true bipartisanship because Andrew Johnson wasn't just a Democrat; he was a Southern Democrat, and Southern Democrats generally believed in slavery. But things had already been set in motion by the time he comes to office for Congress to pass the 13th Amendment, and eventually for all the states that weren't fighting against the Union during the Civil War to ratify it. And they ratified it fairly quickly. And on December, I believe it's December the 1st or December the 5th of 1865, 13th Amendment frees the enslaved peoples living across the United States, pretty, everywhere. The Emancipation Proclamation, by the way, does not do that. That's what the 13th Amendment does. The Emancipation Proclamation is an executive order that essentially says to slaves, if you want to be free, all you have to do is run away from wherever you are, anywhere that in which the Confederacy is in control, and come to Northern Territory where Union armies happen to be, and you will be free. That's what Emancipation Proclamation is. The 13th Amendment just abolishes slavery altogether, except in cases in that of being incarcerated. If you're incarcerated, especially during hard time, you can expect to work, pretty much in slavery-like conditions, which has become a bigger and bigger issue over time, but has been in place pretty much since the end of 1865. So there's that. Anyway, so what do African Americans do when Reconstruction happens? Well, according to your readings, with roughly 19 out of every 20 enslaved black folk being illiterate, they basically spent most of their time in the years between 1865 and 1880 learning how to read, which is true. It is actually part of the story. Freemansboro, other local charities and organizations brought from, via Northern missionaries, the few blacks, the 5% of blacks who actually knew how to read or write despite slavery in the South, founded schools, founded organizations to teach people how to read. But that's not the main story. That's really not the main story here. It's part of the main story, but it's not the main story. The first thing the formerly enslaved, freed people, black folk did after slavery was ended were basically, well, they celebrated, first of all, but aside from celebrating, they also went about trying to put their families back together. Slavery decimated families. People had to move. Had to move to find their families, to find their sisters, to find their brothers, to find people that they had jumped the broom with, which is, basically an informal marriage with another person, right? Find their loved ones, find their kids. And that went on for during the entire period of emancipation. Entire period of Reconstruction. Folks looking for their loved ones, their families. So it wasn't as simple as learning how to read and write. They might have learned how to write their name along the way. They might have taken time out to do those things, but that didn't take up the whole 10 years. They also had to find work. Since slavery is over, they had to figure out a way to work. And usually that involved either tenant farming or sharecropping, which we'll talk about a little bit later, like is the next week, describing the particulars of that, where you're under contract to rent a piece of land, and basically keep and and pay for that land on a rental basis while keeping the profits from your crops. Or sharecropping if you couldn't afford to rent your land, but you basically are renting everything, right, including the crops themselves, and you only get to keep a share of it. And as a result of that, a lot of people stayed in poverty as a result of that. So a lot of movement of 4 million black folk across the South during the course of Reconstruction put their families together. For those who did know how to read and write, and those who were leaders usually ended up being, people who were running, informal churches for enslaved Africans, enslaved blacks during the antebellum period. A lot of those people became politicians. And during Reconstruction, with Union control over the former Confederate states, they were given the opportunity to be delegates to new state constitutional conventions where they could basically help rewrite constitutions where the Constitution would say slavery is outlawed, slavery's been abolished, right? But not just that. They had certain demands, and their number one demand was literacy in the form of public education. Because prior to Reconstruction, public education did not exist anywhere in the South. The reason why it didn't exist anywhere in the South was because Southerners didn't want black people and poor whites to learn how to read. In fact, it was strictly forbidden by law in these states for a black person to know how to read and write. It was punishable by fining, by imprisonment, even by death, not just for the slaves, not just for enslaved people, but even for the people teaching them, to discourage them from teaching them. Slave owners sometimes taught their progeny, right? Their half white, half black, or whatever combination progeny how to read because they look so much like them. Why not teach them how to read? They're probably just as smart as I am, even though they were still technically enslaved, right? So the reality is that they don't want that happening because you'll have suddenly you might have a slave insurrection because people can lead slave insurrections. They know how to read and write. People like Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, and other folks who are, planning, slave rebellions or actually started them. So there's that aspect of things. So Reconstruction is about more than just rebuilding the South. It's for African Americans, for newly freed people who eventually become American citizens by law via the 14th and 15th via the 14th Amendment in 1868, and black men who gained the right to vote by the 15th Amendment in 1870. It's about the ability to have an impact on politics, to bring a system of education to the South, and not just building colleges like Howard University in D.C. or Morgan State in Baltimore, or Bowie State, right, in Prince George's County. It's also about having public schools. And in the South, and that includes Washington, D.C., by the way. Georgetown had a school system, and Washington City had a quasi-school system. They have a fully funded, through tax dollars, public education system until black folk came along and started contributing, saying we wanted schools. And they demanded segregated schools because they knew that white folks didn't want to be around them in integrated settings. And they knew that the alternative was to not have any schooling at all, the exclusion of black kids and black adults from public schooling. Why? Because of the black codes. The black codes that had been passed in 1865 and 1866 were meant not just to segregate white from black, but to exclude blacks from public life altogether, right? Laws that included things like black men and women having to give deference to people by stepping off of sidewalks into dirt roads and muddy holes just so white people could get by them on the streets, not being able to go to a restaurant or go to the equivalent the country store to get stuff, right? Not attending the same churches, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Churches are the most segregated part of our society at this point still. Whites don't attend black churches for the most part unless they're evangelicals, and evangelical Christians. The evangelical movement is not the majority of the Christian movement in the United States, quiet as it's kept. So all of those things are factors, but it's not just simply learning how to read and write. And by the way, The literacy rate for African Americans goes from roughly 5% to 25% by 1880, and it goes all the way up to 52% in the South by the turn of the 20th century, by 1900. So it's a very successful campaign to get literacy into the hands of black folk. But that's not the whole story. Reuniting families, figuring out new work arrangements for labor to try to generate income and take care of your families, to take care of yourself. Um, Dealing with the realities that politics are generally against you and that you are only going to have but so much in terms of political gain, so you accept segregation over exclusion. Those are all part of Reconstruction. The black codes were just a preliminary practice, during Reconstruction for what eventually becomes Jim Crow in most of the South, and even to some extent the upper South slash almost North. So um, that's basically this week in a nutshell. There's so much more to this than what I am saying, but I want you to understand that if you understand African American history and U.S. history to basically be one and the same, do you understand that there also have to be support among Republicans, among folks up north eventually for what ends up happening at the end of Reconstruction? And there was. The Hayes Compromise was their support for essentially saying, okay, we're going to abandon African Americans to their fate in the South. We've passed 3 amendments to the Constitution to guarantee their citizenship rights, to guarantee the rights of black men to vote over the age of 21, to guarantee that they are no longer a slave except in cases of being imprisoned. I think that's enough, right? That's basically what they said. I think that's enough. We need to get the country reunited and back to what the business of America is, which is business. And so they did that. And in the process of doing that, they abandoned millions of black folk in the South, in particular, to years of discrimination. Now, some people say this is just as bad as slavery. Um, Beg to differ. Nothing is going to be as bad as slavery. That you know, because you're talking about an entire people being enslaved. Now, some people had it as bad as if it might have been slavery, right? Hundreds of thousands, maybe even a couple million of them. But to say that it's as bad as slavery is to belie how deeply traumatic, deeply denigrating, deeply dehumanizing being treated as a thing is, right? You might not have had any help from Southerners. You might have you might have experienced rape. You were definitely being harassed by the first version of the Ku Klux Klan. You were facing all that going into the rise of Jim Crow. It's still not slavery. It's still different because you can leave, in which many African Americans eventually do. You can leave. You can do other things that um, you wouldn't have been able to do. Now, obviously, if you are incarcerated, you can make the almost equivalent argument. But any other thing, this can't be the equivalent. They wanted, certainly Southerners wanted to reduce, and a lot of white folks wanted to reduce blacks to the conditions of slavery. And maybe they might have had slavery-esque conditions, but it was not slavery. You didn't have a child that was born automatically into slavery expected to work as early as the age of 5 or 6, right? You weren't constantly, repeatedly being raped by your slave owner and then beaten up by slave owner's wife because you allowed him to rape you over and over again. Okay? Those aren't things that are happening in the South after 1865. Whatever else is happening, those things are happening. Lynchings are happening. Other things that shouldn't be happening, a lot of other things that shouldn't be happening are happening. But they're not happening like that. So, anyway, that's my little soliloquy on what we're covering this week. Please email me if you have any questions, and I'll do another recording for week 3.